Extensive bio, and we will drop the rest of her bio in the chat for you to review. Please help me welcome Dr. Emily Zimmerman.
Thank you so much for that intro. I am going to share some slides with you. And I'm really trying to focus on some practical aspects of building trust in community partnerships and community collaboration. Because sometimes the hardest part is figuring out how to do what you are aiming to do. Let's see. Trying to give you the best view. All right, I'm not going to be able to see my notes, but that's all right. We'll wing it. So again, this session, we're going to focus on building and maintaining trust with community partners and collaborators. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start out with some fundamental issues just to cover, make sure that we get those down, going to move into some practical strategies and then dig a little deeper, talk about some specific work we've done on specifically how to build and maintain trust, and then bring in some new resources that might be helpful for you all. So again, just starting with some fundamentals, why community engaged research? There's so many reasons that you might want to embark on community engaged research, although I'm sure many of you have already started this journey or been on it for a long time. But when you consider things like creating new partnerships, improving relationships with the community, developing new solutions and programs, learning about community priorities and new directions for research, and increasingly complying with funder requirements, those are just some of the reasons. But what I would like to point out is if that you're doing community engaged research in an authentic and intentional way, you're probably doing it over a longer term that spans more than just one of these initial reasons that might get you involved. And you may cycle through all of these and others throughout your journey with a particular partner or set of partners. Another fundamental thing is, who are community partners? Sometimes we focus on the community partners that we have the most experience with, and it's good to step outside that box and think a little bit more broadly about who we might partner with as we do research and collaboration. So obviously we can partner with organizations or representatives of organizations, and that could span different types of organizations, whether they're community organizations, government agencies, formal and informal groups. So we don't always have to work with formal organizations and other types of collaborators and partners that look like a group that is pre-existing or more formal than that. But we can also partner with individuals. So those might be people with specific types of lived experience. So for example, people from specific population or interest groups. Individuals can also be people with professional experience. And we can also partner with members of the general community who are just bringing in insight about their community life and context. And another fundamental starting point is this idea of, well, who starts community engagement? How does it begin? So I wanted to call attention to the fact that engagement is not one-sided. It doesn't have to be started by the university reaching out to the community saying, hey, partner with me. And it can start the other way around, where the community comes to us and says, hey, we want to get something done, but we need your research expertise, or we need your engagement expertise or your technical expertise to be part of this community solution. And these types of projects can also start jointly, especially if you've had the opportunity to build relationships with community partners without a specific agenda. And that's not something that we all have the opportunity to do, but if you do have the opportunity to do that, that's a wonderful way to have a starting point that is beneficial to both sides. So like I said, I'm going to focus on practical things today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the principles of community engagement or hear principles of community-based participatory research, but I want you to know that this is where the practical stuff comes from. So we need a starting point, a framework for understanding how to do community-engaged work ethically, what it entails. And so there are a lot of resources out there for you to learn and become familiar with the principles. Important ones are really around taking asset-based view and approach to working with communities, making sure that you're building equitable partnerships that span all the phases of the process, really focusing on co-learning. I see people planning projects where this is one of the biggest pitfalls. They're always talking about what they're going to provide to the community, how they're going to train folks, how they're going to bring their expertise, and really got to counsel people to stop and flip that equation as much as possible or all the time if you can do that. So thinking about what you're learning from your community partners and how that's part of the process throughout. Thinking about community engaged research as something that has an action component, because communities don't necessarily want research, they want change. So what is it about the work that you're going to be doing with your partners that is going to satisfy that motivation for them? And of course, there's a lot of other things here, emphasis on disseminating findings, emphasis on having a long-term process and commitment with your partners whenever possible, addressing power imbalances, and just learning as together how you can honor these principles as much as possible. I do have a resources section in the last two slides of this presentation. So for example, if anything's referenced here, such as the publications that you can go to learn more about these principles, those will be on the last two slides, or you can look up those resources. So as I mentioned, principles of engagement are a really great starting point. But sometimes what we need to learn more about is the concrete steps that are needed to accomplish our goals. So that's what I'm going to try to look at today. I've done a lot of different community engaged research projects. Many of those were with a community university partnership called Engaging Richmond. So a lot of times when I think about how to do these things, I think about what we did right or wrong with a group like Engaging Richmond. And since we're starting to talk about building trust, I thought I'd bring up this little anecdote. So we started working together in 2011. We had the goal of creating a community health equity report. So we really wanted to work with community residents. We were focused on the East End. So we invited East End residents to attend a meeting about the project. So this was very open-ended. We weren't recruiting people based on any criteria or characteristic that they may or may not have had, only a willingness to show up, right? And during that first meeting, we asked them to talk about research. Had they ever heard about research projects in their community? Had they ever been involved in any? And we made it an open session where they could tell us about their understanding and experiences, and they had a lot of negative experiences to share. And we talked, we answered questions, and we spent time to learn about why they actually came to this meeting. So when people who have negative experiences try again and they show up to a meeting, it's important to know why. What made them come, and what did they hope to get out of it? So having the opportunity just for this one simple discussion really set the stage for being able to build a relationship moving forward, because we learned a lot about not only what those potential folks who could join our team wanted out of the process, but we also heard a lot of what they did not want to come out of the process. And that might be something that you might not be aware of if you don't start a conversation about it. And I learned a lot. Sorry, my screen is getting covered up right now. Again, about how to proceed with this project based on just that one session of learning together. So one of the first steps, which kind of comes out of that anecdote, is, and we're going to talk about this again in a later slide, but sharing motivations and goals. So one of the principles around engagement is transparency, right? You want to be honest about what you're doing and why you're doing it, how you're doing it. But that's a one-way street, right? What you need to do again is flip the equation and create space for the people that you want to work with to share their motivations and hopes and expectations. And a lot of people get worried that there's a mismatch. Well, I'm in this because I really need to know more about this one issue and we want to promote, we want to advance knowledge in this issue, et cetera, et cetera. But the people in the community, they have other motivations and goals, and then they're worried that they can't continue with their project or their partnership because there's not necessarily 100% alignment in why people are at the table. And I would say that's okay. As long as you're transparent about it, then you can work through that together. And like I said, we'll get to that in an upcoming slide. So getting to know you is really important. If you're embarking on a partnership, here I have community university partnership, but it could be any type of collaboration or partnership. You want to have as much opportunity as you can to get to know each other, not just the motivations and goals, but the way that you can work together as a group based on your similarities, your differences, your needs. And so how much time can you spend building the foundation with the group or groups that you want to work with? And now this is where the trouble comes in. A lot of times our partnerships start with grant funding. And that can be a real big roadblock in terms of building trust and relationships, because when your partnership starts with the grant funding, you're on a clock. Your grant funding comes with timelines and objectives to meet within those timelines. And so a lot of times you're expected to hit the ground running with your research. You're expected to start developing your data collection plan and collecting data and analyzing data. And we didn't have time to build a foundation. We're getting to know each other at the same time that we're trying to get things done. And it happens all of the time, but it's a challenge. So if there is any opportunity to get to know your partners before the grant funding starts, that is always going to be a big plus for you. And that many folks find that that's the process of actually co-developing a grant proposal together. But if you can do it even before that, even better. So, some funders like Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, they fund engagement grants knowing that this is an important part of the process. You need to engage with each other first before you can start building a research program together, before you can start collecting data and all the other things that go with that. But I would say that probably the majority of the projects do start with some sort of project and grant funding that has to be done. And so you're just going to have to be intentional about, as we're doing the work required for the project, how are we also doing the work of getting to know each other, getting to trust each other, and building that foundation. These are just some concrete examples of steps in getting to know each other. Everybody's heard about icebreakers. They're wonderful because, sometimes you have a bunch of strangers around the table and they need to start developing relationships quickly. They can allow us to show who we are as individuals and also what our commitments are to the project and to the community. But people might think that an icebreaker is a one-time thing, and it does not have to be a one-time thing. So we have collaborations where we do icebreakers at every meeting because they build off of each other. They tell people that if we're going to spend time doing an icebreaker at every meeting, we have some commitment to continuously trying to get to know each other better. And that's important too. There's a lot in the literature about how important it is for, let's say, university folks to be present in the setting, in the community that you're working with. Now, I would, as somebody who isn't always in the settings of the communities that I work with, I would say of course, that is important, but if you can't be there physically, there are other ways to be present for your communities that you're working with. So that could be, for example, providing them with the data or the training to present what they want to present within their communities, for example, or supporting them in other ways that makes them successful in what they're doing in their communities. So that's just an example. One of the parts of getting to know your community collaborators is actually learning as much as you can about the community itself. This sounds so basic, but it's not. It's really something that people might skip over because they know what they know, right? Oh, I'm a subject matter in this, so I know what I need to know. But do you really understand the history and the culture and the networks and the power and the cultural norms of the folks that you're going to be working with? So one thing you can do, obviously, is you can do your own research ahead of time. You can look at the stats. You can look at some of the history. I'm sure everybody on this call is pretty good at accessing data, sharing data, discussing data. But I would say the preferred approach, if you can do it, is to learn from your community partners. This is a great opportunity for you to start the co-learning process. What can the folks who you're collaborating with do to inform you about all of these things? So one example from Engaging Richmond was early in the process of meeting together, our community residents brought in a presentation on a history of their community. And they presented it to us, and we tried to build in things like that throughout, right? So at every moment, what is it that you can learn from them as opposed to bringing to them? So even if you are the content expert, let's say in a specific health condition, you know all about this health condition, they're still the experts in the lived experience of that condition. So with everything that you want to share about what you know, make sure that there's hopefully equal time for them to share about what they know. Developing governance procedures can be very important depending on the type of relationship that you have, but there's not just like one way to do this. There are very formal and informal ways to go about thinking about how you're going to work together, how much you need to codify that. So if you want formal relationships, you could do a memorandum of understanding or some other type of formal agreement. You can document your shared principles. You can develop guidelines, group guidelines for things like how will you publish together? Who and how will you present information? Who will have ownership of data that comes from this project, and what does ownership mean? But again, another recommendation is those things should be developed by and for your group. So I'm sure you could find an MOU online, but handing something to your group and saying this is governance is probably not the best way to go. But if your group feels more informal than that, that's okay. You can develop governance and guidelines for working together through discussion, group agreement. One group that I'm working with just started the process of developing its own ground rules. And that's, another example. You might think, well, if you're going to have efficient, productive meetings, there's one set of ground rules that works in all contexts. And I would say that that's just probably not the best approach. The group I'm working with has its own norms around language, for example, what would be appropriate language to use in the group, or how to set boundaries, personal boundaries and group boundaries, so that people can work together without without triggering problems for each other. For example, I have another group that I'm working with where a lot of the agreements tend to be around promoting as much accessibility as possible. So I said we would go back to the idea of having disparate goals and motivations, and not being afraid of the fact that your goals and motivations and those of your project might not on the surface appear to align completely with those of your community partners. And I would say start out the process assuming that that's going to be the case, because research and community life are two different things, right? So research, we know, research takes time to accomplish. It has its own timeline. It takes time to get the results, to publish the results, to disseminate the results. But it's not just the timeline, it's also the outcomes. You know, as researchers, we're usually pretty happy to get peer-reviewed journal articles or to have advanced the evidence on the topic of interest. But those outcomes can be pretty esoteric to community members and not on their list of what they were looking for. So with the timeline, you might find that community members would be impatient for results. They want to see some change. They want to see something tangible that they can use as soon as possible. That's okay. It's not built into your grant timeline, but it can be built into your collaboration timeline. So maybe that's a way to look at it in terms of your grant timeline is what you need to do to complete the research and meet your funding requirements. Your collaboration timeline could be aligned with that, but have its own milestones and interests. So confronting the idea of misaligned goals and motivations is your opportunity to plan for how everybody in the collaboration is going to get what they need out of it. So for example, even though your scientific results and data might not be publishable for 5 years, you may have some very useful intermediate results that can go back to the community quickly. Again, another example from Engaging Richmond. So we were doing a project to develop a research agenda on chronic diseases. And, that was going to take time. But some of the early work that we did with focus groups and community discussions highlighted a lot of needs in the community. And so our community partners were ready to take that information right away and say, how can we bring this to the community? Not only did we learn about what the gaps are in terms of what people know and what they have access to, but we can put together a list of resources that might help people fill those gaps. So that's the collaboration timeline, right? That outcome was never part of our grant outcomes. It was never part of our timeline, but it fit with our collaboration timeline, and it was doable. And so there was no reason not to do that and to support that. So you can work on your community identified needs in tandem with your research needs. And together with your collaborators, strategize those actions that can flow from your research results. So those actions may be things like sharing data back with the community, but it might be something else that comes up in the process. They might realize, for example, that there is a program missing in their community that is sorely needed. You don't need to wait for the research results for your community collaborators to start thinking about how they can support a way to bring this needed program to their community. And that is a tangible outcome for your project and your collaboration. So I have a whole bunch of points on this slide and the next one on addressing some challenges. So this is kind of a little bit of a laundry list, but hopefully you'll see something here that piques your interest. So the top line there is address challenges together as you come together throughout the project. So here are some things you might want to think about. How your collaboration addresses representation and diversity. And the term representation can be a little bit loaded. So even defining representation might be a place to start. What is the impact of systemic racism, trauma, and structural inequality on your work and your collaboration? So assuming that there may be some impact, you might want to think about, this is part of building that foundation. How are you going to work together in a way that recognizes these challenges? Again, minimizing power differentials comes to that as well, but minimizing power differentials is a very is a process that requires purposefulness, right? I mean, I've many times felt like, oh, the way I show up is enough to minimize power differentials, but I'm sure that falls short. So trying to be as intentional as you can is a good goal. Something that's often left too late in the partnership collaboration is how sustainability is possible and how it can be pursued. Again, a lot of times these partnerships and collaborations can come down to funding. So we know that funding eventually ends, and we should be thinking about building in sustainability throughout the project if possible. The way that I like to start doing this early is in leadership development. How is it that we are developing capacity among our partners and in the broader community to keep working on this issue, to pursue their own goals and motivations in the absence of a grant funded structure? You want to think about how to demonstrate cultural humility and respect. So this goes, cultural humility is one of those things that's highlighted prominently in the principles of engagement. But people might not always think about how it plays out. So one of the things I've been learning about cultural humility is that it also has a lot to do with ways of knowing, respecting other ways of knowing, respecting traditional ways of knowing, respecting ways of understanding that don't come from our scientific viewpoint, and also respecting the differences in worldview and perspective and experience that our partners are bringing to the table. And of course, how to build capacity for all partners. We'll talk more about that hopefully as well. So I mentioned power dynamics, how you want to be intentional about that. There are loftier ways to start addressing this issue, but I wanted to keep this piece as concrete as possible. So I put some considerations that are concrete considerations that you might want to take into account. Access to technology, for example, especially in the age of virtual meetings. There's a lot of folks out there who don't have great access to technology or don't understand the technology that we're using. I have a couple of projects right now that are addressing this head on. I have one project in rural areas that's providing Starlink hookups, both for specific individuals, such as our community advisory board members, but also in community spaces, so that members of the community who have limited access can use those. Have another project that we're actually providing internet connected devices to every collaborator who needs it. But also thinking about the role of training for technology and that sort of thing. You want to think about how you provide and share information. This is exceedingly important. We're used to providing and sharing information in a way that suits our colleagues within the university setting, and that is often not the best way to share information with our community partners. Thinking about training and professional development opportunities. This is such a big bucket. I don't know how to drill down on it right now, but there are some things that jump to mind. having opportunities for community members and partners to present at professional conferences or to present in civic spaces are wonderful opportunities. Most of the projects that I do that are at least maybe community-based participatory research oriented have a lot of technical training involved. So people may actually learn new research skills and that sort of thing. You want to think about alternative ways that your collaborators can share their ideas. Understanding that it takes people a different amount of time to process, to be ready to speak up, or they might not be comfortable sharing their ideas in, let's say, a large Zoom meeting. So we like to think about, well, how can we make sure that their ideas are heard and respected, even if they have to show up in a different way? And this one is really important to me, this last bullet, building in multiple or alternative ways to participate. Sometimes we get to community engagement in a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So everybody's going to be a community advisory board member, or everybody's going to, participate in this specific way. Maybe a member of the team, for example. But the truth is that not everybody can show up for the same type of role. So I like to be intentional about building in different opportunities. So yeah, maybe we'll have a community advisory board, but maybe we'll also have work groups, and maybe we'll have members of our community on the research team. Or maybe we'll have opportunities to bring in larger numbers of the community to take place in different activities. And maybe we need to think about innovative approaches to including people. So I have down there, for example, through the arts, through performance, through storytelling. So thinking outside of the box about what it means to participate and what it means to share your ideas and perspectives. Probably need to speed up a little. So self-determination and leadership, thinking about how your community is taking on leadership opportunities and a role in the project. This goes really well with an asset-based approach to collaboration, because you have to always remember why you're collaborating. You're collaborating because your partners have important things to share and bring to the table. They have resources, knowledge, and experience. So how can you always be building off of that? And I've always tried to emphasize that if you're going to do something in a community, work with existing community folks and leaders. I've heard so many times, oh, we planned an event in a community, but nobody showed up. Except you didn't reach out to the people in the community who could tell people about the event, and people would trust that person and maybe show up. So thinking about that. We also talked about the idea of shifting leadership as your work progresses, so that eventually maybe you're working yourself out of being an important part of this collaboration. Some other concrete steps you might want to think about: having a trusted community liaison or navigator on your team. That could also be called a boundary spanner. This is somebody who is comfortable with the research side, but who's trusted in the community. Who can bring ideas back and forth between the community and the team. I did mention encouraging partners to take on important roles in research, even if they have to learn new skills. So yes, community folks can learn how to develop research questions. They can conduct interviews and surveys. They can facilitate focus groups. They can analyze data. There may be some training and co-learning in that process, but it'll make it stronger. Whenever possible, share in project management. So as PIs, we're trained that we have to do all these things, but try to figure out when you can turn over those responsibilities, or at least share them. And update and identify your priorities with regular check-ins. So here are some steps. Key check-ins: are there enough community members on your research team, and who's missing? Are your meeting times and places convenient? is information provided in lay language. That's super important. Even on a meeting I was having the other day, somebody spoke up and said, I heard acronyms. I don't understand. I don't know those acronyms. And everybody was willing to jump in and share that information. Making sure that the agenda not only reflects everyone's priorities, but hopefully is co-developed. Making sure expectations are clear and hopefully that everyone is compensated fairly for their contributions. Just some more keys: communicating regularly, facilitating transparency, making sure everybody's views are heard, sharing decision-making. You can read these all out. I want to get to the next part because this one is exciting to me. We've been working on a project to figure out how to build and maintain trust. This is a group called Disability Advocates in Research, or DARE for short. This is a project that was funded by PCORI and is from the VCU Partnership for People with Disabilities. And this is a group of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities who we've been working with through this project. And they have been working on defining trust in their own terms. And so we've reviewed literature on trust and identified trust building strategies. I'm sorry, my computer wants to restart, and I think that's a pretty bad idea. And I can't get rid of the box. Okay. I'm going to go to the next slide. So when we worked with the DARE group, they talked about a lot of things that are important to building trust, such as feeling valued and secure, comfortable making mistakes in an environment where they can feel seen, heard, and validated. And they emphasize that trust grows over repeated and consistent positive interactions where they feel listened to and supported. So this was their 6 key elements of trust. So we have safety, congruence, meaning alignments between words and actions, accountability, so owning your mistakes, empathy, genuineness, so authentic interactions, and vulnerability, being able to be vulnerable without fear of harm. And one of the things that came out of this was the idea of trust dynamics, that trust is a spectrum. So we talked about deep trust, which you might experience in your close interpersonal relationships, such as your best friends or your partner. Expanding trust is with people who maybe you feel close to, like family and friends and long-term supporters or professionals. And then we talked about basic trust, which is where a lot of this collaboration happens. You may have basic trust with your coworkers, people who you're collaborating with. So this basic trust, they said, is based on respect, patience, and a desire to collaborate in good faith. But it is important to recognize that trust can be gained, lost, and regained, and that if you lose trust, you can restore it, but it requires work. And this is how it looks like, this continuum of trust. So it's not a completely upward path. You can go from distrust to basic trust. You may lose ground, but you can restore it. You can expand. And in some cases, you can build up toward deep trust, but that's not necessarily an expectation for productive collaboration. So the DARE group came up with a bunch of recommendations for trust. They answered a bunch of questions and discussions, such as what you need to build trust, what research teams need to do to partner with you to build trust, etc. And some of the areas they came up with were fostering empathy, inclusivity, and respect. So I'll let you look at some of these. Celebrating diversity, respecting all team members, having grace and patience, being aware of emotional cues. So one of the ways that we do this in our meetings is we respect people by taking time in all of our meetings to have a round robin discussion, so that each time people can tell everybody in the group what's important to them at that moment, what's on their mind. Then they thought it was important to build familiarity through personal connections, structured introductions, and regular meetings or informal gatherings. So one of the ways we do this is with our leadership spotlight. So every time we have a meeting, someone from our group is invited to do a leadership activity of their choosing. Oh, this is a different one, actually. This is one where we ask people what opportunities they've had in the past month to be a self-advocate. So we actually do both things. We do a leadership activity where somebody can lead an activity of their choosing, or we may just ask them to highlight their advocacy activities that they've all engaged in. And we might do something like this. Let's talk about your bucket list. Again, getting to know each other and respecting each other's motivations and ideas and personalities. Of course, this is a group of people with disabilities, and they talked a lot about ensuring accessibility through things like universal design, sharing information in multiple formats, and learning the group terminology and inclusive communication practices. So again, we talked about effective communication and empowering team members. So again, some of the ways that we do that is making sure that people think the meetings are going well. So we ask them questions if we can about what went well during the meeting, how it could have gone better. Sometimes we build in time for a brain dump. This is an opportunity to acknowledge the fact that people might have had ideas that came up between meetings, or they may have questions that came up between meetings. And sometimes those things never come to light because there isn't space for them. So we create a space for them. And they talked about feedback and follow-up, such as always making sure that we have a log of the recommendations that they've made and the actions that we've taken. So for one of our groups, we developed the pin bin, which is sometimes people bring things up that we can't address in the meeting or they're not directly relevant, but that doesn't mean that we're going to drop them from view. So we keep this idea of a pin bin, which is making sure that we keep track of the ideas that come up that we could get back to at another time, or that maybe we can come back to in another context. So key takeaways: that trust building is a dynamic process that should start with deliberate planning before collaboration and be revisited throughout the project. When you think about the recommendations, such as the ones that the DARE group made, think about concrete actions that can be taken by your team, as well as the things you shouldn't do. And again, asking what is working and what isn't working for your collaborators. Also recognizing there's no one size fits all approach that either works for all teams or for all individuals. So keep in mind that each team member is an individual with individual needs, and consider how to tailor communication and decision-making in a way that respects differences. And then finally, and this came up a lot in terms of being humble and acknowledging missteps so that you can rebuild trust. So that was what we learned from DARE that I wanted to share with you. And this is the last thing I want to share with you, which is a relatively new resource: 7 core competencies to enhance the quality of community-based co-production research partnerships. I'm sure you can use these 7 core competencies in other more broader contexts. But the idea around these capacities, again, was to be intentional about what you need to know how to do well to collaborate well. I don't think I'm going to read all 7 to you, but if you go to the article again, which is in the resource list, it was just published in 2024. It really digs down into each of these competencies in terms of what are the skills that you would need to develop to have this competency. So for example, number 6, ability to instigate sustainable change processes in the context of political policy and advocacy in the communities that you're working with. So if you wanted to be able to effectively meet this competency, what are the skills that you need? What are the tools that you need to bring to the table to do this? And so the article provides an idea of those skills and tools, provides examples of how that might look in a real project, and then some metrics for how to know how well you've done that. So that one is the fourth one listed on this resource list, Osano et al. It was really a very collaborative project in developing these 7 core competencies. So you'll see that the author list is very long because there were people from all different positionalities who collaborated to develop this resource. The bullet at the top is the DARE group trust building guide. It's still in development, so it's not published yet, but I just wanted you to know that that will be a resource that will be available. And that's it for the formal part. So I think I rushed through in enough time to get us some questions in.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, for engaging in an enriching conversation about building trust and with partners and collaborators. We now have time for a few questions. Since we are thrilled to have so many of you with us today, we will field questions in 2 forms. Please feel free to add your questions to the chat or raise your hand, and the DCE team will read questions aloud from the chat and then call upon those with their hands raised. Misty will go ahead and get us started with a few questions that were previously in the chat, and then we'll go from there.
Hi, yes, thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So the first question that was posed is, how do we, the researcher, identify the right change that we can practically move forward?
So I would just say that you should do that together with your community partners. So the right change isn't going to come just from your data and your findings. It's going to come from what's acceptable and important to the community. What are the gaps in the community? So even if you found the thing that needs to change, that doesn't mean that you know how to change it until you work with the community. Do you need to change a policy? Do you need a new program? Do you need a new collaboration to get this thing done? So yeah, I would say develop that together.
All right, thank you. The next one is, what are the incentives and rewards that flow back into the community?
There can be a lot of them. The co-learning and capacity building piece, this should lift up not only the team members who've actively contributed, but the larger ecosystem if you've done it well. I see in the audience we have Leah Gregory, who was with our Engaging Richmond team, if she wants to weigh in on that. But we had so many members who joined our Engaging Richmond team who rippled out their capacity building to their neighbors, to their families, who went on to careers that they hadn't thought about when they first started the work. Leah, would you add anything to that?
Not really, but I think I would emphasize like the importance of it and how the outcomes can be so much bigger than just the project that you're doing. So I myself am a product of doing community engaged work in the role that I have now. So I'm the community collaboration program manager for the Wright Center. And so previously I did work with Engaging Richmond and other community members. And so our capacity was built up in such a way that we were able to then navigate, jobs and be able to be paid for the work that we were doing. So I think it's really important to kind of emphasize that as an outcome outside of research, is that you're really building capacity and creating a pedestal for people to be able to navigate this work and opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. So
thanks, Leah. And I think that goes beyond individuals. I've worked with projects where the community organizations and we were partnering with, we're just amazed how much better they could collaborate with one another in the community to get things done because they collaborated together on this one project.
Okay, thank you. And this was the last question that I saw posed during the presentation. So this one is, when you do publish, do you contextualize the community in the intro to the paper? If so, can you comment a little on that? How much historical background, etc., is needed?
That is such a good question because it's such a difficult decision to make, because as a social scientist, I come from a background of trying to anonymize things like where your research setting is. But when you do community collaboration, that's not always an acceptable route to take. So yeah, we do like to describe the history and the challenges and the assets of the community that we're working with as much as possible. But that's really going to depend on the type of work and the type of community.
Okay, those were the main questions in the chat. I'm not sure if at this point, Shallon, if you want to open it up.
Yes, if anyone here has questions, go ahead and feel free to raise your hand so we can get your questions addressed. And I do see thank you, Stephen, a question about sharing the resources. We will be doing that as well. What are the main barriers that basic scientists can overcome to engage more with community members?
I think that's a great question. I think that I've talked to some basic scientists who are, maybe they're doing bench science or they're developing, pharmaceuticals or something like that, and they haven't experienced what community engagement can add to the process. And I think it's important to think about who's supposed to benefit from the work that you're doing in the long term. It could be several phases or steps out from the part that you're playing. But if you understand who's supposed to benefit, then you can start working back to what do I need to know from them to know what directions my work should go in or how I should do it to ultimately get to what's important to them. So there's always a constituency for the work that you're doing, and their perspective on what's important is going to make your work better, whether that's ethically, whether that's the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve, whether that's acceptable routes to get there, whether it's who's most in need. Oh, there's so many questions that any researcher could benefit from asking. So if you start with the well-used phrase, nothing about us without us, and work backwards to what you're doing, you're going to find a way that community engagement is going to benefit your work.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for providing us with your expertise as we continue to enhance community engagement here at VCU and build towards thriving communities. We will continue the professional development opportunities on March 20th with Dr. Megan Guff, discussing reflections on cultivating long-term university and community partnerships. And we'll place that registration link in the chat for anyone who is interested in go ahead and registering for that, as well as we'll place the graphic for you all for your reference. And then lastly, before everyone leaves, I know your time is precious and we thank you so much for being here. We would like for you to complete a brief feedback survey for us. We have a few moments and we will remain here to provide the space for you to complete it now. For those of you who have to leave, we do understand, and please do complete it when you have a moment. And thank you so much for your time and participation today, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks for coming, everybody. So nice to see all the thank yous in the chat. I super appreciate it.